Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Sirius Report. My name is Ken. I'm here as usual with Paul. And Paul, one of the things that has really become of a recent note that has been sort of under radar in the world of multipolarity is Russia's advancement into bilateral agreements and communications relationships with Africa. Paul, as always, I want to thank you for being a part of this great discussion. And there's some interesting things that have transpired over the past few years that I think are important to talk about in the world of multipolarity.
Yeah, well, thanks for joining as well, Ken. Always a pleasure, as we know. And yeah, Russia's role in Africa is very interesting because it's coincided with the end of what I would call neocolonialism, with effectively the Americans and a lot of the time the French being kicked out of countries who've said, we've had enough of this. We want to, be in charge of our own destiny. You're not going to provide us with security anymore. And we like the idea that Russia does this because all over Africa, there has been huge problems with Western backed militias, terrorism, you name it, that have been obviously causing mayhem across the entire continent. We had civil wars, everything about trying to disrupt Africa as a continent, prevent its rise. And I've always said Africa will be the surprise continent in the next 20, 30 years, and maybe sooner. But I think this big, huge change in terms of not just military cooperation, but also economic cooperation with Russia and Africa is important. And, it doesn't diminish what the Chinese are doing. But just to give some recent examples, and then we'll go on to a little bit more of what's happened in the more recent or the more distant past, should I say. It's interesting that there is the Central African Republic, which again is a real flashpoint for conflict. There are armed groups there trying to oust the president, Touadera. And it's interesting that, of course, there are Russian forces there to support the president. And it's interesting with regards to this that Putin recently met with Touadera in Moscow in what were his first international talks this year. Now, for anyone who doesn't know, there's been decades of conflict in the Central African Republic. And this, of course, mirrors all this instability we've seen across the entire African continent, where we're seeing this increased reliance on Russia's military supervision and military assistance becoming more and more prevalent. And this, as the Western influence across Africa diminishes, in tandem. Now, when you look at Russia's foothold in Africa, it's expanding enormously. Interestingly, of course, it's in the Sahel region, which is very mineral rich, but there's been endless coups there, armed rebellion, insurgency, and there's a lot of now anti-Western sentiment there. And this has contributed to the French being kicked out of countries and the Russians being welcomed with open arms. So Ivory Coast and Chad are the latest in being former French colonies. They're demanding the withdrawal of the French and other Western forces. Previously, we've had that in Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. And yes, those three countries are now controlled by military juntas who turn to Russia wanting support and in terms of security, and basically telling Western partners of the past, go away, we're not interested, we don't trust you, we think you're responsible to a large extent for the problems we have in our country. Now, we're not here to defend the actions of military juntas overthrowing leaders because that is not democratic, of course, but we're just trying to explain what's happening in these countries. And it's spreading across that whole sort of middle band Sahel region in Africa. But there are also other non-Western former colonies like Equatorial Guinea that has Russian military instructors. They were deployed there the back end of last year. Why? Because they're trying to protect the presidency of the country. Now, yes, the president there has ruled for 45 years following a coup back in 1979 or so. But at the end of the day, they're all reaching out to Russia and saying, please provide assistance. And also, of course, we know, for example, that Russia's bolstered its presence in Libya. Okay, Libya split between West and Eastern Libya, and that they're backing Eastern Libya. And also when you look at the Central African Republic, Russian forces have been there for about 6 years now. And it's interesting, they were there quite a few years before the French basically were kicked out in 2022. And it's interesting when you look at Macron, who's trying to throw his weight around and actually had the audacity to criticize African leaders, claiming they were showing ingratitude over the deployment of our forces, saying that the Sahel states only remain sovereign because of the arrival of French forces. And he actually really tried to dismiss the idea the French had been expelled, saying that France was reorganizing itself on the continent. What, reorganizing itself so it's kicked out of everywhere? I mean, that's just a ridiculous statement. And he goes, oh, but we actually left there because of these coups d'etats, because France no longer had a place there, because basically we're not going to sit there and be seen to be supportive of these military juntas, as the West refers to them. Where in reality, France was kicked out. But this again is just, it's so embarrassing for the United States as well to be kicked out. But that gives a very high sort of 30,000 foot initial my perspective on these big changes that are happening. And the Western media tends to not want to really talk about it, but multipolarity is moving in, the Russians are moving in, the Chinese are moving in, and unipolarity and neocolonialism is being expelled. And for me, I think it's long overdue, because the way we in the West have treated Africa for hundreds of years is being frankly appalling.
Besides treating Africa in the sense, obviously South Africa stands out as where the colonial powers pretty much just pillaged everything and left the country to waste. But what also stands out more is just how much Russia is respected and seen as a strong ally, if not, I don't want to use the word savior, but as a strong partner to the Muslim world. And we're talking, of course, the relations with just about every country in West Asia. We're talking about North Africa. We're talking about now into Central Africa. What is it? At least 43 different countries have strong relations in some capacity with Russia.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's clear that Russia's relations are growing stronger and stronger. And if you look at, there's now Russian African summits. You look that basically when they've had them, pretty much sort of like nearly sort of around 50 out of 55 African countries were represented there, not all by heads of state, but certainly by heads of governments as well, or vice presidents, sometimes maybe someone who's part of the government itself. But very few countries don't participate. And that's because they see a future where it's not just in terms of the military support that Russia can provide to these countries, but also in a broader sense, there's all the economic, financial cooperation, and this also technologically, and how, of course, for example, Russia can extend the grain exports to African countries, which they've done so, and also because effectively, if you look at Africa as a continent, that Russia has never condemned any country. It's rather like the Chinese attitude: we're not here to tell countries how to run themselves. We're here to provide support as much as we can. And it's worth noting with regards to the Ukraine war, and you look at the UN voting that has gone, that a large part of the continent have supported Russia. There are quite a lot of abstentions because they don't want to create political mayhem. But in terms of supporting resolutions, there's very few countries who disagree with Russia's perspective on this. And that's why across the African continent, there are no sanctions that are being applied to Russia with regards to this, and a refusal to do so. And this is a big sort of change that the West didn't grasp. It thought continents like Africa would capitulate, do as they were told, because they've always historically done as they were told. But Russia's influence is growing in the region, and it's also not just in North Africa and the Sahel region, but also obviously we've got South Africa, for example, Zimbabwe, and places like Angola, Namibia, etc. And this is an enormous change that the West just cannot understand and relate to, because it just doesn't expect a country like Russia to be welcomed anywhere, because as far as they're concerned, the world, meaning the Western world, because that's all they think the world is, despises Russia, so everyone else should do. And that, of course, is clearly not the case.
One of the more fascinating things about Russia is, Africa, is that as they're not emerging out of full colonial dominion, but they're really getting rid of the remnants, but they haven't really developed as a whole. I think Rwanda is one where, with the help of China, has really started to accelerate development. But I think there's a lot of countries that are really on the cusp of doing it, and by connecting themselves to the BRICS, as well as the support from Russia and China, they are opening themselves up to facilitating new payment systems that can easily be outside of the dollar and outside of the SWIFT system, outside of unipolarity, and more taking a look at what Russia and Iran are doing. Not only did they just, Russia, this is a small side note, but in their agreement, not only did they sign military agreements, but they also are talking about connecting their payment systems to each other. Africa is ripe for a new type of payment system that is outside the dollar, outside the old, and if you want to call it Bretton Woods, is a remnant of the colonial system. And they're also starting to embrace cryptocurrencies in a capacity. So with Russia and China and many of the BRICS nations leading the way in alternative payment systems, that in itself is going to be a huge foundation for the development of Africa, not just in their being able to export and import and sell goods and stuff, but also in being able to use resources to get credit to start building infrastructure and the like. And that's why out of all the countries, Russia and China are the two biggest ones that can develop Russia, where the colonial powers, yes, they did bring Africa out of its old nomadic ways, but it also left a bitter taste in their mouths that they don't really want to choose that system. I in many ways, I'm thinking about it is when Russia solidified as a country, they sent out ambassadors to the world to see which religion they wanted to do. They went to Rome and find out Catholicism. They went to the Byzantine Empire to find out Orthodox. They went to the Islamic world, and they chose the one that best represented them. And I think in many ways, Africa is looking for that new religion in the way of development, and they're choosing the multipolar world and the BRICS nations to help them.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you look just recently, just a very small side note, Nigeria has been admitted as a BRICS partner. This was via the Brazilians, but we're not getting into that specifically. But going back to Russia's influence, if you look at it militarily, that Russia has strong influence in like Libya, in Niger, in Sudan, in the Central African Republic, as we said, in Mali, in countries like Mozambique, South Africa, Burundi, and the list goes on and on. And of course, Russia has huge arms agreements. They're the biggest arms provider now to the African continent. That's all over Africa, not, just the nations we've made reference to. And if you look also with regards to trade and who the main trading partners are with Africa, Russia's beginning to grow, because if you look in terms of export from Russia to Africa, it's agriculture, it's food, it's oil, gas, and coal, for example, electrical equipment, and other high-end sort of technological equipment and products, and also there is imports to Russia from Africa, including food and other clothing, etc., and ores and whatever. So that is a growing side to it. It's not just Russia taking a foothold militarily, and Russia wants to also assist all over Africa in terms of mining considerations, in terms of energy. So this would also include things like putting nuclear power for peaceful means in countries. So some obvious examples would be like Mali and Burkina Faso in that regard, but there's oil and gas projects all over Africa, including in North Africa, like Algeria and Libya, for example, but also they've got them in Nigeria, Cameroon, in Angola, and obviously, other countries. We don't need to list them all. And there's nuclear cooperation agreements with countries in place for future development, like Kenya and Tanzania, and also huge mining considerations in countries like South Africa, Namibia, Zimbabwe, obviously in the Republic of Congo, Sudan. The list goes on and on. Russia is everywhere, all over the continent. And in my own podcast, I've been detailing all these developments for years and highlighting the huge presence Russia has in African mining and energy market. And this continues to grow. And this is something the West has no capability of changing. I mean, Russia's signed nuclear cooperation agreements with, I think, 20 countries or more. It's probably 24 now or so. So, and the list goes on. And this is just another example where Russia's role there is multifaceted. And everyone goes, well, how's this possible? Because China's in Africa. Well, they don't tread on each other's toes. They work in complementary ways. And it's perfectly feasible to have Russia and China in Africa. Everyone's happy there. The only countries who aren't happy is the West, because their role and their influence is being rapidly diminished. And it's allowing Africa to begin to thrive as a continent. Biggest problem, though, militarily is ending all these civil wars that are often caused by the West, and ending all these militants and acts of terrorism that go on there, and all these coup attempts and everything else. It's a very complicated, fractured continent, but gradually multipolarity is the solution, as you say, Ken. That's why they're embracing it, as opposed to unipolarity and neocolonialism, which is being used to effectively destroy these continents and not allow them to thrive and grow and expand. And that's why I really do believe in the next 20, 30 years, Africa as a continent will really change out of all recognition. And it's going to be not because of Western countries, but because of countries like Russia and China and other countries that will start to take a foothold there as well, because it's not about countries dominating as has happened in the past. Everyone's welcome there. At the end of the day, if countries can offer cheaper alternatives to Russia and China, well, they're going to expand in Africa as well. That's called, free market economies, where countries can go in, and if you can provide services or offer exports at a cheaper price, well, countries are going to go with that country. The days of beating up continents with unipolarity are over.
Yeah, I think one final point to make is the sort of comparison to what we're seeing with Russia in Africa, China in Africa, and what the new Trump administration appears to be wanting to do, going back to the 19th century Monroe Doctrine, hegemonic control and dominion over, in this case, Greenland or Panama Canal, or et cetera, et cetera. So they want to see about reseizing the control that has been slipping through the colonial fingers for the past 70, 80 years after World War II. And instead, we're seeing the multipolar world offer bilateral relations and new ways to do self-development, sovereign development, instead of the vassalage that they've been under for probably 500 years.
Yeah, it's a great point. Just to re-emphasize what you said, Ken. It is. I'm okay. Let's see what Trump actually does in the United States. But talking about we're going to acquire Greenland, is just so it's neo-colonial. I mean, acquiring a country, or we're going to seize control of the Panama Canal, which the United States doesn't own, has no right to. Or okay, maybe it was a flippant comment about Canada, for example. But the United States basically is admitting it's lacking in resources and it needs access to resources, and it knows the global South's turning its back on the US. So we're going to adopt neocolonialism 3.0, whatever you want to call it, and we're going to go around the world and just, if we want something, we're going to take it. Well, sorry, the world's moved on, and this is in stark contrast to what we've described in terms of multipolarity and treating other nations with respect. So it's a great point, I think, to end on today with this podcast, Ken.
Absolutely. Paul, as always, want to thank you for being a part of this discussion and for all of your great insights.
Yes, and likewise.
And to everybody here at the Sirius Report community, thank you for all of your support. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, comment. It really helps the algorithms. Send this out to anybody you think would be important to. And until the next time we get together, have a great day.